The government tried to take my worthless land for 1% of its value after I spent 12 years building it. They paid big time. I bought my land 12 years ago for almost nothing. It was 15 acres of rocky soil on the edge of town that nobody wanted. The previous owner couldn't give it away. The real estate agent laughed when I asked about it and said I'd be wasting my money. The county assessor told me the land was basically worthless, and my property taxes would be the lowest in the district. Everyone thought I was stupid for buying dirt that couldn't grow anything. I bought it anyway because I saw something they didn't. The land sat on a natural slope with a creek running through the back corner. The soil was bad for traditional farming, but perfect for lavender. I spent 3 years clearing rocks and amending small sections of earth. I planted my first lavender crop in year 4. By year 6, I had a small but profitable operation selling dried lavender, oils, and soaps at farmers markets. By year 8, I had a farm store on the property, and people drove from 3 counties over to visit. By year 10, I was making more money than I ever had working office jobs. I built something from nothing on land everyone said was worthless. Then the county noticed. A man named Commissioner Holt showed up at my farm store one afternoon. He walked around looking at everything like he owned the place. He picked up my products and put them down without buying anything. He asked how business was going. I told him it was fine. He said he was surprised anyone could make money off this land. He said the county had been watching my progress with interest. I didn't like the way he said interest. 2 weeks later, I got a letter saying the county was reviewing property lines in my area. They claimed there might be errors in the original survey from decades ago. They said my property might actually be smaller than the deed indicated. They said some of my land might technically belong to the county. I called the assessor's office and asked what was going on. A woman told me these reviews happen sometimes and I shouldn't worry. I worried anyway. I pulled out every document I had from when I bought the land. The survey was clear. The property lines were clear. The deed was clear. Nothing had changed in 12 years except that my worthless land was now worth something. A month later, Commissioner Holt came back with 2 other officials. They walked my property without permission and took notes. When I asked what they were doing, Holt said they were just verifying some information. He said the county was considering a new road project and my land might be in the path. He said eminent domain was always an option, but they preferred to work with property owners. He smiled when he said it like he was doing me a favor. I asked what they were offering. He said they'd give me what I originally paid for the land plus a small adjustment for improvements. That was less than 1% of what my farm was now worth. I told him that wasn't acceptable. He said I should think carefully about my options. He said fighting the county was expensive and usually pointless. He said most people just took the deal and moved on. I didn't take the deal. Instead, I started asking questions around town. I found out Commissioner Holt's brother-in-law was a developer who had been buying up land on the other side of my property. I found out the proposed road would connect that land to the main highway, making it perfect for a shopping center. I found out Holt had been pushing this project for 2 years, but couldn't make it work because my farm was in the way. The county didn't need my land for a road. They needed my land so Holt's family could make millions. I stopped being cooperative. When the county sent surveyors, I told them they needed written permission to enter my property, and I wasn't giving it. When they threatened legal action, I told them to go ahead. When Holt called me personally to discuss a reasonable solution, I hung up on him. Then I started making their lives difficult. I applied for every permit and protection I could find. Historic agricultural designation, environmental watershed protection because of my creek, small business development grants that came with strings about land use. I got my farm classified as an agritourism destination, which added another layer of regulations about what the county could do nearby. Every application created paperwork. Every paperwork created delays. I attended every county meeting and asked questions about the road project. I asked for environmental impact studies. I asked for traffic assessments. I asked for public comment periods. I asked why Commissioner Holt hadn't recused himself given his family connection to the developer. I never accused anyone of anything. I just asked questions and watched them squirm. Other landowners started paying attention. Some of them had gotten similar letters about property line reviews. I spread the county records across my kitchen table and started organizing everything by date. The documents showed a clear pattern once I laid them out in order. Edmund Kruger bought his first parcel 2 years ago, then another 6 months later, then 3 more over the following year. I pulled up the county property maps online and marked each purchase with a red dot. The shape that emerged made my stomach tight. Every single piece of land Kruger owned sat in a horseshoe around my farm. The only gap was my 15 acres, and the proposed county road would cut straight through my property to connect his land to the highway. I printed copies of everything. The purchase dates, the property descriptions, the amounts paid. I made a timeline showing how Holt started pushing the road project right after Kruger bought his 3rd parcel. I documented every visit Holt made to my farm, every letter the county sent, every thread about property lines and surveys. The file grew thick with evidence that this wasn't about public need. This was about making Kruger's worthless land valuable by stealing mine. The next county commission meeting happened on a Tuesday night. I sat in the back row of the meeting room with my folder on my lap. About 30 people showed up, mostly contractors hoping to bid on county projects. Holt sat at the front table with 4 other commissioners, looking bored while they discussed sewer system upgrades. I waited through 40 minutes of routine business until they opened the floor for public comments. I stood up and walked to the microphone at the front of the room. Holt's eyes narrowed when he saw me. I asked why he hadn't recused himself from the road project, given that his brother-in-law owned all the land that would benefit from it. The room went quiet. Holt's face turned dark red, and he leaned forward in his chair. He said there was no conflict of interest and I was making false accusations. I didn't argue with him. I just asked if Edmund Kruger was or wasn't his brother-in-law and whether Kruger did or didn't own the parcels surrounding my farm. Holt said family relationships didn't create conflicts and the road served public transportation needs. The other commissioners shifted in their seats and exchanged looks. One woman commissioner asked Holt if he had disclosed the family connection when the project was proposed. Holt said it wasn't relevant and changed the subject back to the sewer discussion. I sat down knowing I'd made my point in a public forum that would be in the official meeting minutes. 2 days later, my phone rang while I was restocking shelves in the farm store. A woman's voice asked if I was the person who spoke at the commission meeting. I said yes and asked who was calling. She said her name was Nora Lyons, and she lived 3 miles east of my property. She got a letter last month saying the county was reviewing her property lines and might have found survey errors. The letter used almost the same language as mine. She attended Tuesday's meeting after seeing the agenda included discussion of the road project. When I asked about Holt not recusing himself, she recognized the same pressure tactics the county used on her family. We agreed to meet at her place the next morning to compare what the county had sent us. Nora's land was smaller than mine, only 8 acres, but she ran a successful tree nursery selling native plants. We sat at her kitchen table and laid out our letters side by side. The wording was nearly identical. Both mentioned possible survey errors. Both suggested our property might be smaller than our deeds indicated. Both came from the same office in the county administration building. Nora said a county official visited her property 2 weeks ago and walked around taking notes without permission. He told her the county might need an easement for utility access. She asked around town after getting suspicious about the timing. 4 other landowners told her they'd received similar letters or visits in the past 6 months. All of them owned property that would affect Kruger's development plans if the road went through. One family owned land where the road would need to curve. Another owned the parcel where the road would connect to the existing highway. We realized Holt wasn't just targeting me. He was running a systematic campaign against everyone who stood in the way of his brother-in-law's project. 3 weeks after my conversation with Nora, a certified letter arrived at my farm. The county filed formal eminent domain proceedings against my property. The legal language claimed urgent public need for transportation infrastructure to serve growing community requirements. They cited traffic studies and economic development projections. The notice gave me 30 days to respond, or the county would move forward with seizure and compensation based on their assessment. I read through the documents twice, feeling the situation shift from harassment to real legal threat. This wasn't Holt making threats anymore. This was official court action that could actually take my land. I knew I needed a lawyer who specialized in fighting eminent domain abuse, not just someone who handled general property cases. I started searching online for attorneys who'd won against counties trying to abuse their power. I found Rajesh Norwood's name on a property rights advocacy website. His profile said he'd handled 3 cases where counties attempted eminent domain seizures for private development projects. He won 2 of those cases and got a major settlement in the 3rd. I called his office and got through to him the same day. He asked me to explain the situation from the beginning. I told him about the 12 years building my farm, Holt's visits, the insulting offer, the family connection to Kruger, and now the formal proceedings. He asked specific questions about my creek and the watershed. When I mentioned I had environmental protection designation for the creek, he got quiet for a moment. Then he said the county's environmental impact study was suspiciously brief for a project that would affect a protected watershed. He asked me to send him everything I had about the creek, the watershed boundaries, and any documentation of the environmental protections I'd secured. He also wanted copies of all my permits, the property survey, and every communication from the county. Rajesh spent 2 weeks reviewing everything I sent him. Then he called and said he was ready to file our response. He would challenge the eminent domain on 3 main grounds. First, insufficient documentation of genuine public need since the road primarily benefited private development. Second, incomplete environmental review that ignored the watershed impacts. Third, conflict of interest given Holt's family connection to the main beneficiary. He also planned to request all communications between Holt and the county legal team to expose coordination with Kruger. The filing would cost $8,000 up front for court fees and initial legal work. I sat at my kitchen table looking at my bank account. $8,000 was a huge amount of money, but losing my farm would cost me everything I'd built over 12 years. I told Rajesh to file the response. A week after Rajesh filed our legal response, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. A woman said her name was Dorothea Parks, and she was a reporter with the county newspaper. She'd seen the eminent domain filing in the public records and wanted to ask me some questions. I almost hung up because I didn't trust reporters not to twist everything around. But she said she'd been following Holt's projects for years and suspected corruption, but never had enough evidence to publish anything substantial. She knew about Kruger buying land. She knew about the road project. She just needed someone willing to go on record with documentation. I said I'd meet her, but not at my farm where people might see us together. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop 2 towns over the next afternoon. Dorothea showed up with a notebook and a small camera. She was maybe 50 years old with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. I brought my complete timeline showing Kruger's land purchases matched to dates when Holt pushed the road project forward. I showed her copies of the letters other landowners received. I gave her the timeline of Holt's visits to my property and the insulting offer he made. She took notes on everything and photographed each document with her camera. She asked tough questions about my sources and how I knew certain facts. She wanted to verify everything independently before publishing anything. I liked that she was skeptical instead of just taking my word for it. She said she'd need 2 weeks to confirm property records and interview other sources. Then she'd write something that would make the county very uncomfortable. The county hit back fast. 4 days after I met with Dorothea, a man knocked on my farm store door right before closing time. He said he was the county zoning inspector and needed to examine my commercial operation. I asked what this was about. He said they'd received a complaint that my farm store violated commercial use restrictions for agricultural land. I pulled out my agritourism permit and my business license. Both documents clearly showed I was operating legally within the permitted scope. He looked at the papers and said he'd still need to review whether my operation exceeded the permitted scale. He walked around the store counting shelves and measuring square footage. He asked how many customers I got per day and whether I employed anyone. I answered his questions while knowing exactly what this was. This was harassment designed to create expensive problems while the eminent domain case moved through the courts. This was Holt trying to pressure me from multiple directions at once. The inspector said he'd file his report within 30 days, and I might need to apply for additional permits or scale back my operation. I watched him leave and added his visit to the growing file of county abuse I was documenting for Rajesh and Dorothea. I started making calls the next day. Rajesh picked up on the second ring and listened while I explained the zoning inspector's visit. He asked me to send photos of my permits and business license, which I did within the hour. 3 days later, he filed a motion to dismiss the county's eminent domain case entirely. The motion argued the county failed to show genuine public need and skipped required environmental studies for my creek. Rajesh included statements from 2 environmental experts who reviewed my property and said the watershed was more important than the county admitted. He told me we wouldn't get a hearing for 6 weeks, but at least we were attacking instead of just defending. The motion cost another $4,000, which hurt my bank account, but I paid it because doing nothing would cost me everything. I called Nora and the other landowners I'd met and invited them to my farm store for a meeting. 7 people showed up on a Tuesday evening after I closed. We sat around the store talking about what the county had done to each of us. Everyone had similar stories of letters, threats, and pressure. A man named Tom said the county told him his barn violated setback rules even though it had been there for 30 years. A woman named Sarah got a letter saying her well might be contaminating groundwater, which was impossible since she'd had it tested twice. We decided to form a group to share information and split legal costs when possible. Everyone agreed I should be the main person talking at commission meetings since my case was furthest along and I'd already made myself visible. We exchanged phone numbers and promised to keep each other updated on any new county actions. Dorothea's article came out 4 days later on the front page of the county section. The headline read, "County Road Project Linked to Commissioner's Family Business Interests." She laid out the timeline of Edmund Kruger buying land around my property and showed how the dates matched when Holt pushed the road project forward at commission meetings. She included quotes from public records and commission meeting minutes. She never directly accused anyone of corruption, but she didn't need to. The facts told the story clearly enough that anyone reading could see what was happening. My phone started ringing within an hour of the paper hitting doorsteps. Neighbors I hadn't talked to in years called to say they had no idea the county was doing this. People from town called asking how they could help. 3 different customers came to the farm store specifically to buy products and show support. 2 county commissioners showed up at my farm store the next afternoon. I recognized them from meetings but had never spoken to either one directly. They introduced themselves and asked if we could talk privately. I locked the front door and led them to the back room where I did packaging. They said they wanted to discuss settlement options. They claimed they didn't know about Holt's family connection to Kruger until they read Dorothea's article. They said the county was worried about legal problems and bad publicity. I asked what kind of settlement they had in mind. They said the county might be willing to drop the eminent domain case if I agreed not to sue for damages. I told them I'd consider settlement only if it included dropping all proceedings against me and investigating how this project got approved without anyone noticing the obvious corruption. They said they'd take that back to the other commissioners and get back to me. Holt showed up at my farm 3 days later while I was working in the lavender fields. I heard a car door slam and looked up to see him walking toward me. His face was red and he was moving fast. He started yelling before he got within 10 feet of me. He said I was making a huge mistake by fighting the county and talking to reporters. He said I was causing problems for important projects that would help the whole community. He said accidents happen on farms all the time, and it would be a real shame if something happened to my business or my property. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and started recording. I told him he was threatening me, and he needed to leave my property immediately. He kept talking, saying I didn't understand how things worked, and I was going to regret not taking the original deal. I told him again to leave and said I was calling the police if he didn't go. He finally turned around and walked back to his car, but he pointed at me before getting in and said this wasn't over. I drove to the sheriff's office within the hour. A deputy named Anderson took my statement and listened to the recording on my phone. He made notes and asked specific questions about what Holt said and when he said it. He told me he'd forward everything to the district attorney and suggested I file for a restraining order. I called Rajesh from the parking lot and told him what happened. He said to send him the recording immediately, and he'd file for the restraining order that afternoon. He also said he'd add the threat to our eminent domain defense as proof that Holt had personal motivation instead of public interest. The recording showed Holt was trying to intimidate me into giving up, which proved the county's case wasn't really about transportation needs. Rajesh called me 2 weeks later with unexpected news. The State Environmental Protection Agency contacted him, saying they got an anonymous complaint about the county's incomplete impact study for the road project. The state was opening an investigation into whether the county followed proper procedures before filing eminent domain. Rajesh said he suspected one of the sympathetic county commissioners made the complaint, but we weren't going to ask questions since it helped our case. The state investigation would take at least 2 months, which meant more delays for the county's plans. Every delay gave me more time to build my defense and gave Dorothea more time to dig into Holt's other projects. The judge hearing our case granted a preliminary order stopping all eminent domain proceedings until the environmental investigation finished and our motion to dismiss got heard. Rajesh explained it wasn't a final victory, but it meant the county couldn't force anything while the case was pending. I could breathe easier knowing my farm was protected for now, even though my legal bills kept climbing. I'd spent almost $15,000 so far, and Rajesh warned me it could go higher if we ended up in a full trial. I looked at my bank account and my business income and knew I could handle it, but just barely. The stress of fighting while trying to run my business was wearing me down. Edmund Kruger's lawyer called me 3 weeks after the judge's order. He said Kruger wanted to make a direct offer to buy my property at full market value. He named a figure that was legitimate money, enough to pay off all my legal bills and start over somewhere else with money left over. The lawyer said Kruger respected what I'd built and wanted to make this right by offering fair compensation. I told him I needed time to think about it. I spent 2 days walking my fields and sitting in my farm store trying to decide what to do. The money was real and the fight was exhausting. I could take the offer and walk away clean without more legal bills or stress. I called Nora and asked if we could meet. We sat at my kitchen table and I told her about Kruger's offer. She didn't say anything for a long time, just looked at me with understanding. Finally, she said I had to make my own choice, and nobody would blame me for taking the money after everything I'd been through. But she also said if I sold, it would prove that pressure tactics work, and it would abandon everyone else fighting similar battles. I thought about the other landowners in our group, and what message it would send if I gave up. I thought about the 12 years I'd spent turning worthless rocks into profitable lavender fields. I thought about letting corrupt officials win just because they made things difficult. I called Kruger's lawyer the next morning and told him no deal. I said my land wasn't for sale at any price and I was prepared for the long fight. He said I was making a mistake, but I knew I was making the only choice I could live with. Dorothea's second article hit the front page 3 weeks after her first one. This time she didn't just focus on my case. She'd tracked down 3 families in neighboring districts who sold their land to the county over the past 5 years after similar pressure campaigns. None of them knew about the family connections between their local officials and the developers who ended up with their property. One family sold a farm that had been in their name for 40 years because the county threatened endless legal battles over zoning violations that didn't actually exist. Another couple gave up a small orchard after the county claimed they needed the land for a water treatment facility that was never built. The third family lost their home to eminent domain for a park that turned into a strip mall 6 months later. Dorothea laid out the pattern in clear language that anyone could understand. She showed how the same tactics worked in each case. Pressure through official letters, threats of expensive legal fights, lowball offers that didn't reflect actual value. Officials who failed to disclose family business relationships. The article included photos of the families and their former properties. It showed documents proving the connections between county officials and developers. It made the corruption impossible to ignore or explain away as coincidence. My phone started ringing before I finished reading the article. Nora called first, asking if I'd seen it. 2 other coalition members called within minutes. A reporter from the state capital's newspaper called wanting to interview me about the broader pattern. The county's lawyer called Rajesh demanding a retraction, which told me they were scared about how bad this looked. The article changed everything because it proved this wasn't just about my farm or my fight with the county. It was about a system of corruption that had been running for years, while regular people lost their property and their livelihoods. 4 days after Dorothea's second article published, Rajesh called me with news that made my hands shake. The state attorney general's office was opening an investigation into county land acquisition practices. They'd reviewed both of Dorothea's articles and the environmental agency's findings about the incomplete impact study. An investigator named Grayson Wolf had already contacted Rajesh, requesting copies of all our documentation. Rajesh said the investigation would examine more than just my eminent domain case. They were looking at the entire history of land acquisitions during the time period when the officials involved held office. That meant every deal, every purchase, every project that involved taking private property for supposed public use. Wolf wanted my timeline showing Edmund Kruger's land purchases. He wanted the county's initial offer documents. He wanted the recording of the threats made at my farm. He wanted everything we'd gathered showing the connection between officials and developers. Rajesh spent 2 days organizing files and making copies of everything. He said state investigations like this usually took months, but the Attorney General's office seemed motivated to move quickly given the media attention. The investigation gave us leverage in our legal case because it raised serious questions about whether the county had legitimate authority to proceed with eminent domain. More importantly, it meant people with real power were finally paying attention to what had been happening in our county for years. The county commission called an emergency meeting 6 days after the state investigation was announced. I sat in the public gallery with Nora and 3 other coalition members. The room was packed with reporters and concerned citizens who'd read Dorothea's articles. The 4 commissioners who weren't connected to the scandal looked uncomfortable as they took their seats. They voted 4-1 to suspend the road project pending completion of the state investigations. The vote came after 2 hours of public comment where person after person stood up to talk about county overreach and corruption. One woman talked about losing her family's land 5 years ago. A man described being pressured to sell at below market value. A business owner explained how county officials threatened to revoke his permits unless he cooperated with a development project. When the vote came, only 1 commissioner voted against suspension. He stood up after the vote and accused his colleagues of betrayal and cowardice. He said they were destroying years of careful planning for the county's future. He said they were letting a few troublemakers derail important economic development. He gathered his papers and walked out of the meeting while people were still talking. The suspension didn't end my legal case automatically, but it removed the supposed justification for taking my land. If there was no road project, there was no public purpose for eminent domain. Rajesh said the county could still try to argue they needed my property for future planning, but their position got weaker every time another piece of evidence came out. 3 days after the emergency meeting, the county commissioners held another session to discuss what they called administrative matters. I watched from home on the county's live stream because I needed to work at the farm. The 4 commissioners who'd voted to suspend the road project moved to place their colleague on administrative leave while the ethics investigation proceeded. They cited the ongoing state investigation and the need to maintain public trust in county government. The motion passed 4-0 because the person being placed on leave couldn't vote on his own administrative status. He was still technically a commissioner, but he couldn't participate in meetings or votes until the investigation finished. The local television news led with the story that night. The state newspaper ran a feature about small county corruption. Suddenly, everyone in the county knew about what had been happening. My farm started getting visitors who said they wanted to show support by buying products. People drove out specifically to purchase lavender soap and dried flowers because they'd read about my fight. A woman told me she was proud that someone had stood up to government overreach. A man said he'd been worried about losing his own property, and my case gave him hope. Business actually improved during what should have been the most stressful time of my life. I hired a part-time worker just to handle the increased traffic at the farm store. The irony wasn't lost on me that the county's attempt to take my worthless land had turned my farm into a symbol of property rights that attracted customers from across the region. Our coalition held a meeting at Nora's house 2 weeks after the administrative leave decision. 7 landowners showed up along with 3 concerned citizens who wanted to help push for policy changes. We'd won important battles, but we knew the fight wasn't over until we changed the rules that had allowed the corruption to happen. Nora led the discussion about what specific policies we wanted to advocate for once new leadership was in place at the county. We spent 3 hours drafting proposals for stronger conflict of interest rules. We wanted mandatory public disclosure of any family business connections within 3 degrees of relation for all county officials. We wanted enhanced protections for agricultural landowners facing eminent domain that would require proof of overwhelming public necessity, not just convenience. We wanted independent review of all major land acquisition projects before any official proceedings could start. We wanted penalties for officials who abused their positions for private gain. Nora volunteered to present our proposals to the commission once the current crisis resolved and new commissioners took office. A retired teacher in our group offered to help write clear summaries that regular citizens could understand. Someone else volunteered to organize a petition drive to show community support for the reforms. We were thinking beyond our individual cases now and focusing on systemic changes that would protect future property owners from going through what we'd experienced. Grayson Wolf's investigation moved faster than anyone expected. 6 weeks after it started, Rajesh called me with information that made my heart race. Wolf had uncovered financial records showing payments from Edmund Kruger to the county official who'd been placed on administrative leave. The payments were disguised as consulting fees for a company that didn't actually provide any services. The financial trail showed $200,000 moving from Kruger to the official over 18 months. The dates matched up perfectly with the timeline of land acquisitions and the road project planning. Bank records showed deposits that corresponded to key votes and decisions about the development. Wolf had also found emails between the official and Kruger discussing how to handle property owners who wouldn't cooperate with their plans. The evidence was clear enough that the Attorney General's office was preparing criminal charges. Rajesh said they were looking at corruption, bribery, and abuse of office. Each charge carried potential prison time if convicted. The news broke on the state wire service that afternoon. By evening, every major newspaper in the state was running stories about county corruption and bribery charges. My phone rang constantly with reporters wanting comments. I told them all the same thing. I was glad the investigation had uncovered the truth, and I hoped justice would be served for everyone who'd been hurt by the corruption. The judge hearing our eminent domain case scheduled a hearing 2 weeks after the criminal charges were announced. Rajesh and I sat at our table, while the county's lawyer stood up to explain why they were withdrawing their case entirely. The lawyer said the county no longer wished to pursue eminent domain, given the changed circumstances and ongoing investigations. He said they recognized the project lacked sufficient public purpose justification. He said the county wanted to resolve all outstanding matters and move forward with clean governance. The judge asked if I agreed to the dismissal. Rajesh stood up and said we did, with the understanding that the dismissal was with prejudice, meaning the county couldn't refile the same claim later. The judge ruled that the county had failed to demonstrate legitimate public purpose and noted the ongoing criminal investigation into the project's origins. He dismissed the case entirely and wished me well with my farm. Rajesh shook my hand as we left the courtroom. I felt 12 years of anxiety lift off my shoulders in that moment. The land I'd built from nothing was officially mine without any government claims against it. Nobody could take my farm anymore. Nobody could pressure me into selling. Nobody could threaten me with legal battles. I owned my 15 acres free and clear, and I'd fought off one of the most powerful forces a citizen can face. I drove back to my farm and walked through my lavender fields feeling lighter than I had in years. The county's new interim leadership reached out through Rajesh 3 days after the case dismissal. They wanted to meet about settling any potential civil claims I might have against the county for the harassment and legal expenses I'd endured. Rajesh and I met with 2 commissioners and the county's new lawyer at a conference room in the courthouse. They started by formally apologizing for what had happened. They said the previous administration had violated public trust and my property rights. They said the county wanted to make things right and rebuild credibility with citizens. They offered to cover my legal fees as part of a settlement agreement. Rajesh had prepared an accounting showing I'd spent $32,000 defending my property. The county agreed to pay the full amount without negotiation. They also agreed to issue a public statement acknowledging that the eminent domain action had been improper and that I'd been right to challenge it. I accepted the settlement because the money would remove the financial burden that had been crushing me for months. I also accepted because I wanted to give the new county leadership a chance to prove they were different from what came before. I told them I appreciated their willingness to take responsibility for cleaning up the corruption. Rajesh drew up the settlement documents and the county cut a check within a week. I deposited $32,000 back into my farm account and felt like I could finally breathe again without worrying about legal bills. The former county official resigned before the ethics board could vote to remove him. His lawyer released a statement saying he was stepping down to focus on his legal defense and didn't want to distract from county business. The resignation came 2 days before a scheduled ethics hearing that would have been public and embarrassing. The district attorney added new charges based on the recording I'd made of threats at my farm. Witness intimidation carried its own penalties separate from the corruption and bribery charges. The criminal case was building into something that could send him to prison for years if he was convicted on all counts. His arraignment happened on a Tuesday morning. I drove to the courthouse and sat in the public gallery to watch. He walked in wearing a suit instead of the casual clothes he'd worn when visiting my farm. His lawyer entered not guilty pleas to all charges. The judge set bail and trial dates. I watched him walk out of the courthouse in handcuffs after the bail hearing because the judge considered him a flight risk given the severity of charges. Seeing him in handcuffs felt like justice finally catching up to corruption that had hurt too many people for too long. Edmund Kruger's development projects collapsed within weeks of the criminal charges becoming public. Banks pulled financing for his shopping center plans after learning about the bribery investigation. His business partners distanced themselves publicly, and some filed lawsuits claiming they hadn't known about the illegal payments. The district attorney filed charges against Kruger for bribing a public official and conspiracy to commit fraud. The charges meant Kruger faced prison time too if convicted. The land he'd bought around my property sat empty with for sale signs going up on several parcels. Without the road connection he'd tried to steal my land to build, his development plans were worthless. Several parcels went into foreclosure as Kruger's financial situation deteriorated. I drove past his empty land one afternoon and noticed how similar it looked to what my property had been 12 years ago. Rocky soil that nobody wanted. The difference was that I'd built something valuable through honest work while he'd tried to profit through corruption. His shortcuts had caught up with him, and now his supposedly valuable development land was worth almost nothing without the infrastructure he'd planned to force through using his family connections. The county commission meeting room filled up fast the night we presented our policy proposals. Nora stood at the front with our coalition's recommendations printed and organized in folders for each commissioner. She walked them through the conflict of interest requirements we wanted, explaining how commissioners should have to step back from votes when family members stood to make money from county decisions. The new commissioners listened and took notes. One asked questions about how other counties handled similar rules. Another wanted to know if 3 degrees of relation was standard or if we should expand it further. We spent 2 hours going through every detail of our proposals, answering concerns and explaining why each protection mattered. The commission voted unanimously to adopt the new ordinances requiring recusal for family financial interests and strengthening agricultural land protections against eminent domain. They added language requiring documented public necessity that went beyond just claiming a project served the public good. The rules weren't perfect, and lawyers would probably find ways around some provisions, but they created real barriers that would make another situation like mine much harder to pull off. I watched the commissioners sign the ordinance and felt like we'd built something that would outlast our individual cases. 3 months after the judge dismissed the eminent domain case against my farm, I got a call from a state legislator's office asking if I would testify about eminent domain reform. The legislature was taking up a bill that would change how counties could use eminent domain across the entire state. Dorothea's articles had gotten attention at the state level, and lawmakers wanted to hear directly from someone who'd fought off an abuse case. I drove to the state capitol on a Tuesday morning with Nora riding along for support. The Capitol building was bigger than I expected, with marble floors and high ceilings that made me feel small. We found the right committee room and sat in the public gallery waiting for our turn to speak. When they called my name, I walked to the witness table and sat down facing a panel of legislators. I told them about buying worthless land 12 years ago and building a profitable farm through honest work. I explained how the county tried to take it for 1% of its value so a commissioner's family member could make millions. I described the legal fight and the stress of not knowing if I'd lose everything I'd built. Nora testified after me, talking about how the coalition formed and how many families faced similar pressure. The legislators asked questions about what protections would have helped us and what penalties would actually deter corrupt officials. The bill they were considering included stronger requirements for proving public necessity and real consequences for officials who abused eminent domain for private gain. It wasn't everything we wanted, but it was significant progress toward making the system fairer. My farm store got busier after all the publicity about standing up to the county. Customers started driving from across the state specifically to support the business that fought government overreach. Weekend traffic doubled and then tripled as word spread through social media and local news coverage. I couldn't keep up with demand working alone anymore. I hired 2 part-time employees to help with the store and product fulfillment. One was a college student who needed flexible hours, and the other was a retired teacher who wanted something to do a few days a week. Having help meant I could focus on the actual farming, instead of spending all day selling products and answering customer questions. The extra income from increased sales let me finally pay myself a real salary instead of putting every dollar back into operations. For 12 years, I'd lived cheap and reinvested everything, but now I could afford to relax a little and actually enjoy the success I'd built. Rajesh called me about setting up a legal defense fund for other landowners facing eminent domain problems. He'd been contacted by several property owners in neighboring counties who were dealing with similar situations but couldn't afford attorneys. We organized a fund with initial donations from coalition members and supporters who'd followed my case through the news coverage. The fund would provide free initial consultations so landowners could understand their rights and options. It could also help cover filing fees and basic legal costs for people who qualified based on income. Rajesh volunteered to handle consultations pro bono for the first year to get the fund established. We set up a simple website explaining how to apply for assistance and what kinds of cases the fund could help with. It felt good turning my experience into something practical that could help others fight back against government abuse. The fund wouldn't solve every problem, but it would give some people a fighting chance who otherwise would have just given up and taken whatever the county offered. Dorothea won the State Journalism Award for her investigation into county corruption. The award ceremony happened at a hotel conference center with reporters and editors from newspapers across the state. I went to watch her accept the award and listened as she gave a speech thanking sources who trusted her with their stories despite risks. She mentioned me by name and talked about how willing I was to go public, even though it made me a target for retaliation. The recognition brought more attention to eminent domain abuse as a serious issue that needed investigation and reform. Several newspapers from other parts of the state hired Dorothea to train their reporters on investigating local government corruption. She started traveling to give workshops on document analysis and cultivating sources in government offices. Her career took off in ways that helped spread knowledge about holding officials accountable, and I was glad my willingness to talk to her had contributed to that success. The newly elected county commissioners held a public meeting to present their transparency plans and get community input on future development. They invited me to speak about protecting agricultural landowners and respecting property rights. I kept my remarks short, maybe 5 minutes total. I talked about how government power should serve citizens instead of enriching officials and their families. I emphasized that development could happen without trampling on people who'd invested years building legitimate businesses on land they owned legally. The commissioners seemed genuinely interested in doing better than their predecessors, and the public meeting format was already an improvement over how things used to work. People could ask questions and raise concerns without feeling like they'd be targeted for speaking up. The new leadership wasn't perfect, but they were making real efforts to rebuild trust that had been destroyed by years of corruption. I expanded my farm by planting 3 more acres of lavender in the spring. The expansion had been impossible before because every spare dollar went to legal defense, but now I had confidence the county wouldn't try stealing my land again. I also added a small event space for weddings and private gatherings, converting an old equipment shed into a rustic venue with string lights and wooden benches. The event space opened up a new revenue stream and brought more visitors to the farm, who then bought products from the store. I hired Nora's daughter for seasonal work during the busy summer months when lavender was in full bloom. 2 other coalition members had family who needed part-time jobs, so I brought them on for harvest help. Having a crew meant I could handle the expanded operations without killing myself working 16-hour days. The farm was growing into something bigger than I'd originally imagined, and it felt amazing to build that growth on a foundation that was finally secure. The trial for Holt ended with convictions on 4 corruption charges. The jury deliberated for less than a day before finding him guilty of bribery, abuse of office, conspiracy, and witness intimidation. The judge sentenced him to 3 years in federal prison, plus restitution of the $200,000 he'd taken from Edmund. Edmund pleaded guilty to his own charges and got 18 months plus a $50,000 fine. Watching both of them face real consequences felt like the system actually worked for once. They'd tried to use government power to steal from people and enrich themselves, and now they were paying for it with prison time and financial penalties. The conviction sent a message that corruption had consequences even for people who thought they were untouchable because of their positions or connections. The coalition celebrated our first anniversary with a community event at my farm. We invited everyone who'd supported us through the fight, from coalition members to people who just showed up at commission meetings or shared articles online. Over 200 people came for lavender picking, live music from a local band, and a potluck dinner where everyone brought dishes to share. Kids ran through the fields while adults talked and laughed and swapped stories about the crazy year we'd all been through. Nora gave a speech thanking everyone for standing together when it would have been easier to just accept what the county wanted. She talked about how we'd proven that ordinary people could fight corruption and win if they organized and refused to back down. I looked around at all the people gathered on my farm and realized we'd built something bigger than just defending individual properties. We'd created a community of people who understood the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it was hard. Property rights organizations from 3 other states contacted me asking if I'd speak at conferences about our successful fight. They wanted me to share strategies for organizing against eminent domain abuse and standing up to corrupt local officials. I agreed to do the speaking engagements even though they didn't pay much beyond covering travel costs. The knowledge we'd gained fighting the county could help other landowners in similar situations, and spreading that information felt important. I prepared a presentation walking through everything from initial documentation to building coalitions to working with media and pursuing policy changes. The first conference was in a neighboring state where several counties had ongoing eminent domain disputes. I told our story to a room full of property owners and activists who were dealing with their own versions of what I'd been through. After the presentation, people came up asking specific questions about legal strategies and organizing tactics. Sharing what we learned felt like extending the impact of our fight beyond just our county and helping create a broader movement for property rights and government accountability. Dorothea called me about doing a follow-up article marking 1 year since her first investigation broke the corruption story. She wanted to document what changed after everything came to light. I agreed and spent an afternoon showing her around the farm while we talked about the new county policies. She interviewed Nora about how the stronger conflict of interest rules were working and spoke with 3 other coalition members about their experiences with the reformed commission process. Dorothea also profiled the Legal Defense Fund and how it was helping landowners who couldn't afford attorneys when counties tried questionable land grabs. The article ran on the front page again with photos of my lavender fields and quotes from coalition members. She ended it with something I told her about how standing up for yourself can change entire systems instead of just fixing individual problems. The piece got shared widely online and brought more attention to property rights issues across the state. The state legislature passed the eminent domain reform bill 3 weeks later with votes from both parties. The final version included most of what we pushed for during our testimony at the Capitol. It required counties to prove genuine public necessity with detailed documentation before starting eminent domain proceedings. It created penalties for officials who abused the process for private gain. It gave property owners stronger rights to challenge valuations and contest takings. Several legislators mentioned our coalition's organizing efforts when they explained their yes votes. The governor signed it into law at a ceremony where I stood behind him with Nora and 2 other coalition members. A photographer captured the moment, and I got a copy of the picture showing us all smiling as the governor put pen to paper. I framed it and hung it in my farm store next to the newspaper articles. Customers asked about it constantly, and I enjoyed telling them how ordinary citizens pushed for legal changes that would protect property owners for years to come. My farm business hit record revenue that year. The publicity from fighting the county brought customers from 4 counties over who wanted to support what I'd built. Sales of dried lavender bundles tripled. My essential oils sold out faster than I could produce them. The farm store needed restocking twice a week instead of once. I finally paid myself a real salary instead of just taking whatever was left after expenses. I put money into savings for the first time since buying the land 12 years ago. The financial security felt incredible after years of pouring everything back into the business and then spending tens of thousands on legal defense. I invested in a new irrigation system that would make the lavender fields more productive during dry summers. I renovated the farm store with better displays and a larger checkout area. I bought equipment that let me process lavender more efficiently. Everything I'd wanted to do but couldn't afford became possible because the farm was thriving and I wasn't hemorrhaging money fighting corrupt officials anymore. Rajesh stopped by one afternoon to update me on the Legal Defense Fund's progress. He brought a folder with case summaries showing 12 landowner families the fund had helped across our county and 3 neighboring counties. 2 cases got dismissed after initial legal challenges when counties realized they couldn't prove public necessity. 3 others settled favorably after counties discovered the landowners had real legal representation instead of trying to fight alone. The remaining cases were still ongoing, but the landowners had competent attorneys who knew eminent domain law. Rajesh explained that just having a lawyer often made counties back down because they knew they couldn't bully represented property owners the way they pressured people without legal help. The fund was evening the playing field between individual citizens and government power. It proved that providing legal resources to people facing eminent domain abuse could stop corruption before it destroyed lives and businesses. I stood in my lavender fields on a summer evening, watching the sun drop toward the horizon. Purple flowers stretched across land everyone once dismissed as worthless, rocky soil. The creek ran through the back corner like it had for decades before I bought the property. The farm store sat near the road with cars parked outside from customers shopping before closing time. Everything I built over 12 years remained mine because I refused to let corrupt officials steal it. The farm was making more money than ever. The community had organized into a coalition that stayed active on local government issues. Holt and Edmund sat in prison paying for their crimes. New laws protected property owners from similar abuse across the entire state. What started as one person defending 15 acres turned into a movement proving ordinary citizens could fight government corruption and win. My land was secure. My business was successful. I helped create lasting change that would protect people for generations. The victory felt complete standing there among the lavender I planted years ago on dirt nobody wanted.